Thanks for tuning in. Yeah, it's me, Darell. You know, that retired guy. And yes, this is a new shirt, Christmas present. Plaid, of course, from my granddaughter. You know, the one who likes to help me fix things. Check out the earlier video, Ode to a Power Washer. She's amazing. Anyway, in this episode, I want to tell you all about the Great Blackout of 2021. What? You never heard of it? Okay. Well, now we're not talking about the night that the lights went out in Georgia. That had more to do with like a corrupt justice system, you know, some backwards Southern lawyer and judge with bloodstains on his hands. No, I'm talking about the night that the lights went out in Quebec. That's the night that our pipes, well, they nearly froze. Don't trust your plumbing to some backwoods hydro company, because that outfit's fighting COVID and it's mostly closed. So you see, at least for that retired guy, the Great Blackout of 2021, well, that's definitely qualifies as another grand adventure. So let me begin. Well, it's Sunday evening, and I'm relaxing after dinner when I get a call from my son. He tells me that the power's been off at his cottage for the last 2 days now, and he's worried that the plumbing's going to freeze. Now, by the way, for my American followers, I think you call it a cabin. As Canadians, we've stayed a little closer to our British heritage, and you see, the word cottage comes from England in the Middle Ages. Peasant farmers, they were called cotters, and well, the modest houses that they lived in, those are cottages. They were simple, but mostly they used them for shelter and to keep out of the rain. Well, it gets a lot colder here in Canada, so when my son says the power's off, that's a problem. Now, my daughter-in-law, she's been monitoring the situation since Friday, and we had a major windstorm blow through at that time. She went on the Hydro-Quebec website and saw that there were power outages all over the place. Now, she's good that way. There's just something about real estate that seems to demand her attention. Anyway, my son Dan wants to go up and put on some heat, and he's got a full day of meetings on Monday, so he doesn't want to leave the cottage unattended and a fire in the wood stove. So I volunteer to go up with him and babysit the cabin. That way he can go into town the next day and work from there. Actually, to be honest, I think the main reason I volunteered is I just like to spend time with my son. Now, if you're an old guy like me, I'm sure you can relate. Like many dads from our generation, our jobs took up all of our time, so we missed out on a whole lot of our kids when they were growing up. As a result, spending time with my kids and grandkids is even more important now that I'm retired. Now, come to think of it, I think the same thing applies to all my fishing adventures. I just get to spend time with my other son, Davis, and on the West Coast, and my brother-in-law, Gary. I mean, fishing is secondary. Now, this isn't the first time my son's had to work from the cottage. Anytime you hire someone to do work on the cottage, you got to be there for the contractors. They don't usually work on weekends either, especially in Quebec. Now, it's not really that big a deal anyway, because my son rarely goes to the office. He works remotely now and, you know, on the phone and the internet. Working from home, well, that's something we could only dream of back in my day. Now, with the cabin being so remote, there's actually no cell signal up there. And until recently, there was no internet either. I mean, back in October, we installed this Starlink system. Now, it works great. And, of course, as long as you have power. Now, the Starlink, it's so fast that even my grandson's happy to go up to the cottage now. He can play video games online with his friends. I'm not sure that was the point of getting a cottage by the lake, but anyway. So Dan and I mounted the dish on an old antenna tower that we bought on Kijiji. That was quite a job raising up that tower, attaching the guy wires and bolting everything down, but worked first time. Now, for my American friends, if you're wondering what the heck is kijiji, well, it's that new Craigslist competitor. Now, it's owned by eBay, and it's now available actually in 220 cities and 50 American states. I mean, if you're interested in learning more, check out my video called Buy and Sell Online for tips about buying used stuff using online sites. Anyway, you might ask, how is Dan going to work at the cottage if there's no power? Well, no problem. You see, there's good cell phone reception in the small town. It's only about 20 minutes away. And he plans to tap into the internet at the local library there. All right, so we got a plan. I grab a sleeping bag and a change of clothes. I step into my winter boots and pull on my Santa's hat, because of course it's Christmas season after all. And my sweetheart, Dan's mom, thinks to pack us a cooler of food. And with a wink and a kiss, we're off to northern Quebec. Now, I should probably give you a little background on this cottage or cabin. How did we get ourselves into this situation? I mean, why do we even care that the power went off? Well, a few years ago, probably about 5, my son and his family decided to buy a vacation property. Yeah, my daughter-in-law just happened to find it when she was browsing through real estate listings, as she's wont to do. And she found this cool little cabin on a lake in northern Quebec. And they picked it up for a good price. You see, it's really small and really was only a 3-season cottage. Now, over the last few years, we've worked to make it into a 4-season cottage. We hired a local concrete guy to come in and pour an insulated cement floor in the crawl space underneath the cottage. My son even dug it down before pouring the concrete so it'd give it a little taller ceiling. Now, it works for me, but it's a bit short for Dan. But he had to make sure he didn't undermine those existing footings. So anyway, no problem. It's great for the grandkids. So then we installed insulation in the whole cabin, walls and ceiling. We installed electric baseboard heaters throughout. And now with the ability to keep the cabin from freezing year-round, we're able to replace the lake water pump with an actual drilled well. Now, we didn't need to winterize that pump and drain the water lines now every fall. So that saves us a lot of time and labor. More importantly, we have year-round plumbing. And that's, of course, as long as we have electricity. Now, the kids bought this cottage from a couple of French Catholic priests. I think they liked it. It's kind of rustic. Came with a wood stove and a bunch of candle holders and candlesticks, the kind that they use on church altars. I guess they were quite familiar with power outages up there. Well, according to my daughter-in-law, the cottage has been without power for 2 days, and the weather forecast is calling for -20. Oh yeah, for all you Fahrenheiters out there, that's freezing cold. It's -4. Of course, this is the Great Blackout of 2021. Now, to be fair, it's nothing like the blackout of 2003 that sent the whole northeastern U.S. and Canada into the dark. There were something like 50 million people without power, and of course they blamed it on a software bug. What do you think? Or closer to home, the 1998 ice storm, it took out 3.5 million people in Quebec and, a million people in Ontario, New York State, all the way over to Maine. So that was another big power outage. For us in Canada, that blackout involved the largest deployment of Canadian armed forces since the Korean War. That was quite an ice storm. Now, thankfully, this is just a windstorm, and it's only affecting remote areas in Quebec, but still for us, it's the Great Blackout of 2021. Okay, so we drive up to the cottage. That goes smoothly. I mean, the wind's still blowing, and it's dark, but we're in a 4-wheel drive Jeep, and as they say in Australia, no worries, mate. For my southern neighbors, it's actually dark by 4:30 here in December. Canadians go to work in the dark, and we come home after the sun is set. Now, if you work indoors, you can go the whole winter without seeing the sun. That's probably why the government's been adding vitamin D to our milk since 1940s. Still, though, it's not enough to fight the C word. It seems like forever since the C word stood for cancer. Anyway, we arrive at the cabin in total darkness. A sliver of moon is peeking through the trees and trying to light our path to the front door. The wind's still howling, and I strain to see this newly installed antenna tower in the Starlink. Remember the one we put up just a couple of months ago? Well, I do a double take, and I shout out to Dan that the dish is gone. Now, we're both staring up at the black sky, and quickly we agree it's just too hard to tell. I mean, now that would be a bad thing if it was gone, but anyway, we got bigger fish to fry. Temperature's dropping fast, and we got to get some heat on. Once inside, I light a couple of those sacramental candles, and Dan heads out to the wood pile so we can start a fire. Now, this is a nice wood stove, not big, but then this is a small cabin. It's a Jotul number 3. It's made in Norway, and they've been making wood stoves there for like 160 years. Apparently, Jotul has one of the largest foundries in Norway, and from what I can tell, Quebec is probably one of its biggest customers. Now, I just looked up 1 in 5 homes in this province, they actually burn wood for heat. I wonder if there's a carbon tax on wood heat. Probably not. So we get going a roaring fire in old number 3, and in short order, the cabin's gone from like minus 20 to plus 10. Yeah, I'm still talking Canadian or Celsius. Actually, out of the 197 countries in the world, there's only 7 that don't speak Celsius. Who knew? As a Canadian baby boomer, I had to learn both of them. I grew up as a temperate bilingual. And as they say, I can go either way. So now it's getting late. My son tells me he's got an early morning meeting and he'll be up before dawn to drive into town. He's got to get cell reception and connect into the library internet there. Now, the fire is going to have to be stoked once or twice through the night to keep it going. So I offer to set my alarm for about 2:30 in the morning. Anyway, I'll get up and put another log on the fire. In the morning, I'll cook 'em up some bacon and some beans. Last weekend, we already changed his tires, but I'm no way washing socks and sewing old blue jeans. Right, Willie Wayne? Actually, the song was written by Shel Silverstein. Yeah, brilliant songwriter. He also wrote A Boy Named Sue, and one of my favorites, the cover of the Rolling Stones. Anyway, 2:30 comes, the alarm blasts, and I'm up with a jolt, smashing my head on the bunk bed. I guess that's why they use bunk beds for kids. Anyway, I get up and I put another log in the stove and head back to bed. I'm only half awake, but I'm starting to notice it seems kind of warm in here. I end up spending the rest of the night sprawled out on top of my sleeping bag. And when I get up in the morning, I check the thermometer, not the electric one, of course. It's useless. This one's one of those old timers, the ones with mercury in them. Well, it's 80 degrees. Now that's American. And I'm sweating. How do you turn down the heat on that old number 3? Anyway, it's time to boil some water for coffee. And oh yeah, now that the sun's up, maybe I better check on that Starlink. I poke my head out the door and twist around to take a look. And thank God, or Elon, or the weather guy, or whoever, it's still there. Now there's no power to run it, but hey, that's a relief. Now, by 9 o'clock, Dan is back. I mean, he's done his morning meetings. Most of the time, he's on the phone with people in Europe and the Far East, and they're not really morning meetings for those guys, but it does mean that Dan's day starts pretty early. He suggests we go into town for breakfast. So we make the 20-minute drive to town to find the 2 restaurants and 1 takeout place are all closed. We take 20 minutes to drive down the road farther to the next town. Story's the same thing. Basically, the pandemic has killed all the small businesses. The restrictions have made it almost impossible to operate. Only those big chains can survive. So hungry and suffering from caffeine withdrawal, we turn around and head back to the cabin. On our way, we stop at the local Marche Bonchois. Actually, my son's better at French than I am, but he pronounces it Bonichiwa. It's really a grocery store. We buy some eggs and bacon and stock up for another long night. We scarf down a chocolate croissant and a coffee, the kind you get at the grocery store. Oh, yeah, they're delicious. And we make a quick stop at the library so Dan can make another call before we head back to the cottage. Now, as I am aimlessly wandering around the parking lot, trying to kill time and stay warm, waiting for him to finish his call, I notice a couple of Hydro-Quebec trucks head up the road in the direction of the cottage. That's a good sign. Maybe they're going to fix the power outage. Now, for anyone that didn't grow up in Canada, I should probably explain. Hydro-Quebec is the provincial electric company, not the water company. The Canadian word for electricity is hydro. That's because for most of Canada's history, our power came from hydroelectric dams, where the energy from falling water spins the turbines. So Canada gets its electricity from water, and that's with the possible exception of Alberta, who, like Texans, are just awash in oil and gas. Now, hydroelectricity is especially the case in Quebec, where they've flooded hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of land to make these massive hydroelectric complexes, like Churchill Falls and the James Bay complex. Turns out 96% of all the electricity in Quebec is hydroelectric. I mean, between that and wood stoves, what more do they need? So whereas in the U.S., your companies have names like Pacific Gas and Electric or General Electric, in Canada, they're all called hydro companies like Hydro-Quebec or Ontario Hydro, that kind of thing. So back to the story. After about an hour on the phone, Dan calls me back to the Jeep, and we're off to the cottage again to check on the wood stove and hopefully cook up some lunch. As we drive in, I'm watching for those Hydro-Quebec trucks. I mean, maybe they found the problem and they're working on it now. Well, they're nowhere to be seen, and we arrive back at the cabin around noon to find the power is still out. Now, lunch is the next order of business, so at least that's my job. Dan's already working offline on his laptop. He's preparing some kind of presentation to take to town later today. Now, a special shout out to my sweetie for sending along 2 jars of homemade soup. I mean, it was excellent. All I had to do was heat it up on the wood stove. We also had a couple of baguettes that we got at the Bonichiwa in town. Nothing like real French baguettes in Quebec. They're good. While we're enjoying our gourmet lunch, I recount stories of my youth and I share random pearls of wisdom that seem appropriate to the occasion with Dan. Dan, of course, smiles and nods, and he can be very accepting of my ramblings when he's otherwise preoccupied with work issues. Now, I tell him how my father used to get up every morning and had to chop wood before going to school. And in my day, I can recall the sweet smell of coal burning in the houses on the way to school. I used to have to walk like miles to school in deep snow, right? They had to shovel the coal into those old furnaces. And I mean, kids just don't know how good they've got it these days, eh? I also told him the trick that my parents had for using our 3-season cottage in the wintertime. They weren't bothered by the lack of running water. We used to haul buckets of water from the lake that we would boil on the stove or use for cleaning dishes. And even more important, we'd use the water to flush the toilet. I mean, who needs a well and a pump when you got buckets? Well, I guess between chewing on baguettes and preparing for his meeting, that story caught his attention. As he heads out the door for the afternoon in town, he says, "Yeah, that's a good idea. Why don't you go down to the lake and get some buckets of water? I'll see you tonight." I'm thinking, me and my bright ideas. I don't know if I mentioned it before, but that lake, it's at the bottom of a steep hill. There's probably 100 ice-covered stairs. This guy's not some spring chicken. Even in the summertime, I budget like 1 trip a day. It's just not a dignified way for a guy to meet his maker. Okay, that's like 2 weird phrases back to back, spring chicken and meet your maker. I find myself doing that a lot lately. Is that something that old people do? So I had to look it up in a grammar book. It's called an idiom. Now, I hate to think what you'd call someone who uses a lot of idioms. Anyway, I find myself inching carefully down the icy stairs towards what I hope is not yet a frozen lake. And thankfully, I'm able to break through that thin layer of ice that's on the lake, and I fill up a couple of 5-gallon pails. Now, I've never really been great at math, but if I'd have thought this through, I'd have realized that 2 5-gallon pails of water, that's going to weigh about 100 pounds. Now, I was worried about getting my own sorry ass up those stairs, and now I got 100 extra pounds to carry? Okay, I know my American friends now are madly typing in the comments section that 10 gallons of water doesn't weigh 100 pounds. Well, you're right. 10 American gallons of water doesn't weigh 100 pounds. It weighs 83. But Canadian gallons, they're bigger. And you know, just like in football, Canadians have a longer field and bigger balls. What can I say? Now, don't let me stop you from writing in that comment section. It does help the algorithm. But my point was that I'm basically carrying another person up those stairs, ice and all. Well, I made it to the top without kicking the bucket. And I'm not saying those buckets were actually full, but we now have winter plumbing. Time to relax, catch my breath. Now, I did dip a pot of that lake water out of the first bucket and set about to making some old-fashioned filter coffee. No need for hydro if you got a wood stove and a filter. Now, I remember way back when Grandpa Pete, he used to have a big pot of thick black coffee boiling away on that wood stove all day long. I mean, it was there for anybody that wanted it, anybody that would dare. Anyway, this cup's for you, Grandpa Pete. Now, I'm well into my book and just starting to bounce off the walls from the coffee when all of a sudden the lights start to flicker and the alarms are going off. Yeah, that's the comforting sound of power coming back on. Just in time, because the sun's setting behind the trees and I was just about to light up those candles. Now, a minute later, the Starlink is up and running, so I text Dan and I let him know that the power's back on. Well, he texts me back and he says he's in meetings for about another hour, so maybe we should just plan to spend the night there anyway. Well, that works for me. I mean, it's starting to snow like crazy and the temp is dropping fast again, but no worries because we got hydro. Now, heading home tomorrow in the daylight, that sounds like a good idea. Well, we didn't actually hit the road the next day till about 4 o'clock. Dan wanted to take advantage of a quiet day at the cottage and his super fast Starlink. He was able to get in another day's work, but I'm not sure he figured on all the distraction he was going to get from his dad. I mean, with all those pearls of wisdom and good advice. Of course, in my mind, he had the advantage of that vast treasure trove of knowledge from that retired guy. So with a half-hour daylight left and the beginning of a freezing rainstorm, we closed up the cottage and set off for home. And again, a big shout out to that four-wheel drive Jeep. After a couple of white-knuckle hours of driving, we landed safely back in our Ontario hydro homes. We're now snug as a bug in a rug. And that's the story of the Great Blackout of 2021. Now, when it comes to people that spout off with a lot of those idioms, well, you can just call me idiosyncratic. Anyway, be sure to like and subscribe. Think about joining the conversation on locals. And until next time we meet, live your best life.